Lads, lasses, and the rest of the masses, welcome back to another tactical breakdown. Today we're going to be looking at Chelsea versus Brentford and talking about this one small change that had a very big impact on this game. Let's go. Alright, so let's firstly talk about the two teams and how they set up, the formations, etc. Let's starting with Chelsea. Now this was a bit different to what we usually see from Chelsea. Normally we see one of the fullbacks invert and we see this kind of 3-4-3. Or instead some kind of variation of the 3-3-4, depending on how the midfield sets up, whether that's in a box or in a diamond. Now, in this game we do see that, but it's a bit different how we do it. Instead of us having an extra centre-back here and playing three centre-backs and one of our full-backs inverting, we actually see both full-backs inverting at times. Obviously, one of them would do it more often than the other, and that one would be Cucurella. So for this example, we'll put Cucurella in the middle. Although he doesn't actually really function here for the most part. We see this shift over, so we get Tosin in the centre, we get Colwell as this left centre-back, and then we get Malo Gusto operating as this right centre-back slash right-back at the same time. And at times he would come into the midfield, depending on where Cucurella is and which side of the pitch we're playing on, but for the most part we would see this, and this is how we kind of set up in possession. Now, as I said, usually we have this box, or sometimes a diamond, and in this game this was a very clear diamond. We saw Palmer playing very, very high up in this central 10 role. We saw Cucurella in this left centre mid role and even getting as far as playing as a left-sided 10, which we've kind of seen him do from time to time in this Enzo Maresca system. Caicedo would come into this middle role, and then Enzo of course would come up with Palmer. And it's slightly different to what we usually see, and there's two kind of different variants of this team, two modes in possession for Chelsea. We see when we are high up in the either middle third or their final third, we see this setup with Enzo out wide here on this right side, Cucurella here in this left side, and then Palmer as the central one. We get this kind of 6v5 here. Obviously when they have the midfielders in, they kind of mark the midfielders, but we leave Caicedo as this solo holding player who can roam across and tries to get it on both sides and intercept when the ball goes long, and obviously our centre-backs all push up really, really high. Now, this is kind of what we see when the ball is in Chelsea's possession, and for the most part we did see this. We had the majority of possession, which we kind of expected against Brentford. They're a very pragmatic, good counter-attacking side, so we would expect them to play deep and then break on us, and we did see that. So we'd expect to have a lot of the ball, and this is kind of what we saw. Obviously, at times when the ball goes back, we can bring Sanchez into the back four, and he sometimes plays here, and we can kind of move the ball around as if he is an auxiliary centre-back, and we have that back four, so we still have the 5 in defence here, even though for the most part he will obviously be back in his own goal. But this doesn't actually start like this. When we're in our first third, when we're kind of building, and obviously Brentford are pressing us, because they did actually step up and press us when we were in our first third. They kind of sat off as we progressed through the pitch, but for the most part they actually did put on a really high press and try and unsettle us, and we had to try and play through that. And obviously that's one of our strengths, is playing through presses. But we see us set up with the 3 centre-backs. We see Caicedo actually go into this kind of left role with Enzo dropping deep in build-up, and this is something we've wanted to see for a long time. With Chelsea, is seeing Enzo not being able to get on the ball enough in deeper positions, and we see that in this game where he plays here, and obviously Cucurella and Palmer then take the 2 10 roles. And though Cucurella would go backwards to kind of help out if we needed an extra body here, for the most part it was actually Caicedo who was kind of operating on this side, and even Sancho sometimes, who would go all the way back to kind of pick up the ball and then play it inward. And it's kind of fun how this works, because we could obviously see Cucurella play here, and he can play in this inverted role with Enzo, but having Caicedo here specifically allows us to get out of that pressure really, really well, because he's so press resistant. And I think that's part of the reason we kind of see this, is because Enzo in this game wasn't very good at kind of withstanding the press, and he got overwhelmed a little bit at times in this game from the immense pressure from their midfielders. And I think in general Brentford's midfield is very, very industrious, very, very good at getting on your back and trying to win the ball back, because that's a lot of where their kind of threat comes from, is them winning the ball high, breaking on you, getting counter-attacks, that type of thing. And Enzo kind of struggled, so having Caicedo next to him, it allowed him to kind of offload the ball to Caicedo and let him do that role, instead of him kind of being caught on the ball all the time. But as I said, for the most part in this game, because we had so much possession, we kind of played in the middle and final third for the majority of this game. That was where the action areas of the game were for the most part, and we played with this 4 at the back here, with Caicedo as this lone centre defensive mid who who was able to try and cut things out when the ball went long. And then we had Cucurella playing really high with Sancho and trying to combine with him. Enzo doing the same on this side with Maresca. Now, we always talk about how Chelsea like to create 1v1s, especially in wide areas, but it was a bit different in this game because of the way that Brentford sets up and they have these wing backs rather than fullbacks. We obviously always try and match up with the fullbacks, but in this case it wasn't as simple as that, because the players that Madueke or Sancho were having to deal with wasn't always the actual fullback. Sometimes it was the centre backs doing that job, sometimes it was the centre mids, which I'm not putting in at the moment just for clarity's sake, but a lot of the time we kind of struggled in this game to do the things which we would usually do. And a credit to Thomas Frank and the way that he set this Brentford team up, because he set this team up the best way possible to beat us, and I think that overall we just kind of had the better individual quality in the end, and that's kind of how we got through. But for the most part we struggled to kind of do what we like to do, which is get 1v1 with players and then try and play balls through if there's midfield runners kind of running through the middle here. And we couldn't really do that because of how Brentford set up. And as we kind of talk about the first half here, we'll segue into that. This was one of the main things that Brentford really tried to do, was to stop us from having success out wide. Now, Chelsea are not a very aerially imposing team. We rarely actually play the ball high into the box, and for the most part we do stick to trying to get our wingers or our centre mids, as I said, into these areas to get cutbacks, because our team is not very physically imposing and they are very, very short. The only tall players in the team are Palmer and Jackson, plus our centre-backs, but obviously Jackson and Palmer aren't the greatest at heading the ball. That's not one of their specialties. They're more better with the ball at their feet and kind of being able to strike the ball when it's on the floor. So this was not kind of a thing that we would usually do, and obviously because against three centre-backs here in this back five that they played, or back three, trying to get the ball in aerially was always going to be something that would be difficult for Chelsea. And Brentford are obviously set up in a way that kind of maximises their potential of defending those types of high balls, winning the ball back and then breaking, because that's how they set up. But the only way you can really deal with that if you want to cross the ball in is with pinpoint accurate crosses, and again that's not something that Chelsea have really got in their locker. We've got one really good crosser in the team, I would suggest, and that's Neto, and he wasn't playing today because he was suspended, so they basically were kind of shutting us out in the terms of they will not be able to get through us if they start crossing it. So what they kind of plan to do, we'll kind of segue into that. What they planned to do was to try and force us to play the ball into wide areas and have no other option than to just play the ball in. And so the way they kind of did this is that they had the three centre mids here, right? And the way that they play is they play with three centre mids. They have and then they leave the two strikers up top, and they kind of forced us, because of this doubling up that they had with their wing backs and their centre mids. They forced us to kind of not go through this way, which is where we want to go. We either have to go all the way around the outside, which is very, very long and we can't do it, or just keep passing the ball between us and kind of looking for openings. And that's what we were doing for large parts of this game. We were trying to probing and trying to find avenues, because playing through the centre, which is another thing that we're very, very good at with players like Enzo and Palmer, was also very difficult to do because of how narrow they were with these three in midfield and obviously the three centre backs. Now you can see just from this very crude kind of demonstration how isolated Jackson is, and getting the ball into our striker was really, really difficult in this game, and they stopped us from doing that for the majority of the time. This left Enzo Maresca with a very challenging dilemma to kind of figure out. If we can't go through the wings and we can't go through the centre, then how do we actually create chances? And well, he kind of came up with a solution which is a bit silly at first, because it's very counterintuitive to what you'd think would be good against this setup. As I said, Brentford are very, very aerially dominant. They've got loads of players in the centre, so it's hard to put the ball into the box and win their balls in the box. But despite this, Enzo Maresca, anticipating this pragmatic counter-attacking style from Brentford, said, to hell with it, put the ball in the box at every opportunity possible. And that's exactly what we did. Every time the ball came out to these wide areas, whether it be with Gusto getting up high or Colwill getting up high because he was getting into these positions as well, or Madueke here, he was just saying, you know what, if they're going to play this way and they're not going to allow us to play the football we want to play, let's try and play the way that they want to play and beat them whilst doing it. Now, as I said, Chelsea are not a team that likes to swing the ball into the box. We don't do it very often. In fact, we have an average of 17 crosses per game, and in this game particularly, we had 34. That's exactly double the normal amount of crosses than we would usually do. And though we did try to play the normal way that we would, with us doing our good wing play, our good 1v1 wing play, playing it through the centre and trying to get the balls through, even just playing through Brentford's press and like kind of leading them onto us and saying, come on, press us, and then playing it through and counter-attacking them that way. We did do that and find some success doing that. That wasn't the main thing that we were doing in this game. Instead, we opted to go early from wide areas and from deep areas too, not just, obviously, as I said, not just with Maresca and Sancho who were trying to put the ball into the back post, but also Gusto, who was getting really, really high and trying to whip the ball as far as possible from these kind of deeper positions. But even, as I said, we saw Colwill getting really, really high. Both our centre-backs at this point getting tasked with going really, really high and trying to put the ball in from these positions and try and feed on any scraps that kind of happen in the box. And that's such a weird style for Chelsea to adopt, but eventually this did actually work. As the old adage goes, a broken clock is right twice a day, and eventually if we just kept swinging the ball into the box, eventually one of them's going to hit the head of one of our players and we're going to get something from it. And that's exactly what happens. Now again, as I said earlier, the cross would have to be pinpoint to beat this type of team, and the one that eventually gets us our goal is just that. It's an absolute peach of a cross from Maresca to this kind of hole between the two centre-backs where Cucurella has snuck into, and he gets ahead of his man despite being the shortest player on the pitch and heads the ball in for Chelsea's first goal. Obviously this happens just before half-time, and it would give Chelsea a 1-goal lead going into the second half. In that second half though, the game played out similarly to the first half, but Brentford were obviously trying to get a goal back and try and get back into the game, and Chelsea were really, really pushing to try and get a second, because we know how Brentford play, we know how good they have been against us in the last few seasons at getting back into games when we're on top of them, or just genuinely being quite annoying and getting goals against the run of play. And obviously because of those two things happening, the game became a bit more open, and this is slightly down to what Brentford did and the way that they kind of changed their game plan, because for the most part what was happening in the first half is that they would win it with either one of their centre-backs or out here with Maresca, and they'd always try and feed it into the right channel for Wissa to run onto, and he was kind of tasked with doing this on his own, or sometimes they'd try and play it through the left, and I think they were more successful down the left, but for the most part we just kept going down Wissa, down to Wissa on this right flank, and he was trying to get up here into these areas, and he was so isolated because of how many players we had played forward, and obviously them trying to have their centre mids here to block us. And usually this would probably be a very, very good way of getting into the game and actually playing this way and getting it to Wissa, but he was tasked with trying to beat Caicedo and Cucurella, who was coming back to try and stop him, and these two had absolutely phenomenal games, especially Caicedo, and he was genuinely unplayable. And it's one of those things where sometimes you just play up against your man and he's just better than you, and that's pretty much what happened in the first half. But in the second half, they kind of changed this a little bit with them trying to get their wing backs a lot more high up the pitch. Obviously, Lewis Potter was the main one. He was getting really, really high. And Maresca as well was trying to get up the pitch too. And what this did, despite giving them, making them more open and allowing us to get our 1v1s more successfully, we saw a lot more success for Sancho, especially coming into this kind of area and then trying to put it across. Obviously, we saw Jackson miss an absolute sitter from this exact type of scenario. But what it did allow Brentford to do, however, is that when they did win the ball and they did get the ball for example from like Mark Flecken saving something, because he was excellent in this game, and they could progress, they actually had more men up here to actually hit. So now it wasn't just going to Wissa and then him getting the ball taken off him, it was now going into Wissa or Mbeumo, who had actually switched over. I think I believe in the second half they kind of were rotating, but Mbeumo kind of came over here, or at least was kind of coming over to assist Wissa, and they were able to get the ball now in these kind of in these midfield areas and actually lay them off to the wing backs to then burst up the pitch and get into these areas and try and break on us and actually put the ball in, because they weren't able to get anything from these balls before because Wissa was losing it, or as he tried to kind of turn around and run up the pitch. But in this case he didn't need to do that. He could collect the ball, play it back to a centre mid, play it back to one of the wing backs and actually get going forward, and that extra committal of bodies actually made Brentford quite an attacking threat on the counter in the second half, and we were very, very lucky that Sanchez had a very, very good game. And it was almost like, though we keep saying we're not in a title race, it was almost like we had a bit of the luck of champions, that kind of thing. They always say the luck of champions, because we had not only Sanchez being absolutely stellar, not only Caicedo and Cucurella being so good, but also just the one of the chances for Carvalho, I believe it was, hitting the crossbar from an open goal, and it's just one of those things where it's like Brentford on any other day could have beaten us in this game, and they definitely could have gotten more from this. At least getting a 2-2 draw is fair for how well they played on the counter attack in the second half, especially. And though they were able to get a consolation late on with Mbeumo from again another counter attack down this right hand side, which the ball is absolutely excellent to him, well timed his run as well. And the ball goes through to him, and he beats Colwill, who's trying to hold the line, and he gets past Tosin, who has to come across to try and get the ball off him, and obviously he puts it past Sanchez, who has to try and recover, and it's a great goal from Mbeumo. But because of the way that they were playing, and obviously they got the consolation, so they're kind of justified in that, the way that they were leaving themselves exposed on the counter is really, really poor for how they wanted to play this game, and it kind of lost them this game. I think despite them going behind in the first half, I think the way that they were playing in the first half was actually good enough to beat us. But with this kind of committal of bodies going forward, we eventually see in the second half that Jackson would eventually get his goal, which he was searching for after missing an absolute sitter. And that comes from them not having Lewis Potter on this left-hand side, and he's kind of up the pitch as we kind of win the ball back, and I believe it's Caicedo again who intercepts a pass and gives it to Enzo. And because of this, when we're kind of playing, and I'll move the players out of the way here so you can you can actually see what kind of happens here, is that Enzo plays this really good ball into Jackson, and because there's no fullback here anymore, or no wing back, he can actually take it, and Collins has actually kind of moved into a left back role up against Maresca here. Because again, with Lewis Potter going forward, they kind of ended up playing like a 4-4-2 at times. Whilst one of the fullbacks or the wing backs would go forward, the other four players in the defence would kind of settle into a 4. So Collins was out in this left back role, and Enzo plays his ball to Jackson, and he basically has to just beat Pinnock because he's the only player here, and this space wouldn't be here if they had the wing backs here. Obviously, if Lewis Potter was back here, Collins would be here, and this would be a much harder thing for Jackson to do because he's got two men to kind of beat here. Instead, what ends up happening is that, as I said, Collins is out of the picture, Lewis Potter's out of the picture, the ball goes into Jackson, and he just simply runs past Pinnock and smashes it into the near post. And it's kind of sad again because Flecken had such a good game that he doesn't get anything from this game. Likewise, I said the same thing with Sanchez, because Sanchez had such a good game, and it was kind of sad that he didn't get his clean sheet, with obviously Mbeumo getting his goal. But I think both teams deserve to get goals in this game. I think both teams could have won this game, and in the end it was just down to that slight edge that Chelsea had in individual quality from players like Caicedo, players like Cucurella, players like Sanchez, who kind of just bailed us out at times. Overall, this was a very good showing from both sides, but Chelsea just kind of had the extra little bit of individual player quality. Obviously, players like Caicedo and Cucurella stopping almost every single counter-attack that they tried to do. Sanchez being absolutely unplayable in goal and trying to, as hard as he may, to keep his clean sheet, unable to, but there we go. Not just that, but his ability to claim the high balls, which obviously another very big strength of Brentford is their set pieces and their long throws. We see Pinnock taking long throws. He was claiming things in the air, stopping them from being able to do that. And again, another player, Tosin Adarabioyo, winning every single one of his aerial battles and stopping the very, very tall, very good from set pieces team Brentford in being able to utilise their main strength, which is that counter-attacking play, that set piece play. Those two main strengths they were unable to do because of how good individuals were in our team. In the end, this was a closely fought battle between two very game teams, and fortunately for us, Chelsea came away with all 3 points, and at the time of recording sit 2 points off of the top of the table. We move on to more action on Thursday as we take on Shamrock Rovers in the final round of the Europa Conference League group stage, and I'll of course be live streaming my pre-match thoughts, predictions and lineup reactions before the match, as well as my post-match reactions after the match with Feeling Blue. But if you want something else to watch until then, perhaps check out this video on screen in the meantime. Thank you guys so much for watching as ever, and remember, in the rain or in the dry, keep that blue flag flying high. Come on, you Blues.